Good afternoon. Thank you so much for tuning in today, Thursday, November 7, as we take a close look at the results of this Tuesday's 2024 U.S. general election. My name is Amy Binder. I'm an SNF Agora Professor of Sociology at Johns Hopkins University, and I'm excited to join you today to host and moderate this in-depth two-part discussion sponsored by the Johns Hopkins SNF Agora Institute and Hopkins at Home. If you're not familiar, the SNF Agora Institute is an academic and public forum at Johns Hopkins University that's dedicated to improving and expanding civic engagement and informed, inclusive dialogue as the cornerstone of global democracy. For today's conversation, we'll first frame and contextualize this week's election by discussing how we arrived at this point. I'll be joined by three of my colleagues at Hopkins, Leah, Wright, Rigueur, Lilliana Mason, and Steven Teles, who will moderate the conversation. After a very short breather, we'll move into the second half of our event, where we'll dive deeper into the results of the election and discuss the potential impact they'll have in 2025 and beyond. I'm fortunate to be joined here by two experts, Eugene Scott from Axios and Soren Dayton from the Niskanen Center. Unfortunately, Rachel Dean Wilson from the U.S. German Marshall Fund is unwell and not able to be with us online today, and we wish her a speedy recovery. Steven Teles will again moderate. As our discussion unfolds, I'd like to remind those of you tuning in live to please use the chat feature below to leave comments and ask questions. We'll be monitoring the conversation and we'll do our best to respond to as many questions as we can throughout the broadcast. So let's dive in and get started. In the interest of time, I'll keep our introductions brief, though I encourage viewers to examine the bios of all of our participants in full online. So first, we have Leah Wright Rigueur, who is an SNF Agora Institute Associate Professor of History at Johns Hopkins and the author of The Loneliness of the Black Republican, Pragmatic Politics and the Pursuit of Power. Leah is an expert on 20th century U.S. political and social history and modern African-American history, with an emphasis on race and political ideology, the American presidency and presidential elections, policies and civil rights movements, and protest and unrest in the United States. Lilliana Mason is an SNF Agora Institute Associate Professor of Political Science, whose research focuses on partisan identity, partisan bias, and American social polarization. She's the author of the book Uncivil Agreement: How Politics Became Our Identity, and co-author of Radical American Partisanship, Mapping Violent Hostility, Its Causes, and the Consequences for Democracy. Steven Teles is Professor of Political Science at Johns Hopkins University and Senior Fellow at the Niskanen Center. He's the author of several books on conservative politics, law, and policy, and is currently working on a book under contract with Oxford University Press with Rob Selden on the Republican opponents of President-elect Donald Trump. So thank you, Steven, Leah, and Lilliana, for joining us today. We are all looking forward to the conversation.
Thank you, Amy. So I should actually note that I did manage to finish that book, and so I thought that I was done having to think about Donald Trump after I published that book and after the 2020 election. But it turns out here we all are again talking about Donald Trump and the Republican Party. And before we get into questions, I should just say that I'm extremely lucky to have Leah and Lily as my colleagues at the SNF Agora Institute. One of the things we try and do is model disagreement and model civil discussion across disciplines, other kinds of divides, in the belief that that helps us get closer to the truth by having all of our biases sort of check each other. So we'll see how much we can actually do some of that here today. And so one of the things we do want to model here is a little bit of the spirit of fallibility, that part of academic work is that we're always having to toggle back and forth between not knowing things and knowing things and then rethinking the thing that we think we know. And so we may investigate a little bit of that here today. So I wanted to start with Leah. I want you to sort of imagine yourself in the Wayback Machine, way back to when you woke up Monday morning and you probably had your coffee and you started imagining, whoa, I'm going to be on a webinar on Thursday. I'm going to have a spiel. What's my spiel going to be? I want you to start out by telling us what you thought your spiel was going to be on Monday based on what you thought was going to happen and based on your scholarship and experience, and then move on to a question about what you think about what you thought you knew on Monday in light of the results that we got in. So, Leah, the floor is yours.
Sure. So I should say that on Monday, I got a request from a magazine that asked me to write a piece that would run actually would run today on a Kamala Harris victory. And so my response was, I wrote back to the editor and I said, this is all Monday. I said, and I am assuming if she loses, you do not want me to write this piece. And the editor wrote back and was like, okay, that's an interesting take. And I said, well, this is one of the things that I teach my students, which is that it doesn't matter what our feelings are necessarily. There always has to be a way that we can kind of think about what are the options in the event of either outcome. And so the other thing that I told my students, because then I met with them, I spoke with them over email. They said, who do you think is going to win the election? And I said, right now, I would give the edge to Donald Trump. And I think a lot of them were shocked by that. I have several students who are working for Kamala Harris. But I said, let me preface this by saying, I said, in this class and the work that we do, we take a deep historical dive to think about contemporary American issues and about the contemporary presidency. And given all that we have learned in this class, including a presentation from Professor Mason on polarization and increasing polarization over the course of the last 4 years, but also everything that we know about the conditions of this kind of election, an incumbent, an incumbent president who also steps down in the middle of the election, a woman candidate becoming the nominee for president of the United States, a Black woman, Black and Southeast Asian woman becoming president of the United States, only having 107 days to prepare for the election, that these kinds of things and this kind of sensibility around the economy meant that we were thinking about for anything other than a razor thin Kamala Harris victory, we're certainly thinking that this is going to be a Donald Trump victory. I will say the one thing that surprised me, there was one element of surprise. I thought that it was going to be razor thin. I did not think that Donald Trump would win the popular vote. That is the part that really surprised me. But everything else, I think, really lined up in a lot of the ways, especially if you take this larger historical context, to really give us an outline that said from the beginning that Kamala Harris, that VP Harris was running an uphill underdog battle. And that, yes, there was a pathway to victory, but that pathway would be difficult, it would be on the ground, and it would really come out to turnouts and margins. I'll say one other thing here too, actually two other things. The first is the disconnect between the economy as it exists, right? We have currently the best economy in the world within the United States. But then what does the economy feel like on people's day-to-day lived experiences? And I'm happy to talk a little bit more about why I saw that as such a bellwether for this election. And so there is a real disconnect between how the economy works in theory and on paper, but also how people were feeling it in their day-to-day lives. The second thing that I think we really have to consider is the intersection between the Biden-Harris administration and the Israel-Gaza conflict and the way that that has played out over the course of the last year. I actually had the opportunity to attend the Democratic National Convention, both as a media participant and as an observer of history. And one of the really noteworthy things was the decision of after the uncommitted delegation after the convention not to endorse Kamala Harris. And so going into that, particularly in the areas of Michigan, where there is a heavy Arab and Muslim population, they made it very, very clear that this was an election that they were willing to either sit out, vote third party, or in what ended up being the case, vote for Donald Trump. Perfect example of this is Dearborn, Michigan, where 45% of Muslim residents voted for Donald Trump. I believe 33% voted for Jill Stein. And then after that, in the low 20s, was support for Kamala Harris. That is an area that normally goes 88% Democratic and did in the last election. So something radical was happening during this period that I think a lot of people didn't necessarily give the kind of attention that we would expect to, in large part because of who the Republican candidate was, right? So sometimes I think people look at this and think, well, this person is pro-Israel, but this person is like, destroy Palestine. And they couldn't differentiate between how that would play out in the actual election. So I'll stop there. Steve, you look like you have a follow-up question.
Yeah, Leah, I just want to go back to one of your things on this sort of theme of fallibility. So the prediction you would have made if you had to write it down on Monday would have been a razor thin result. Presumably, that also meant that there would have been a mixed result in the swing states. So, Harris would have won some, Trump would have
Oh,
won some.
I can tell you exactly what my
So you
prediction
wrote
was
it
for the
down?
swing. Yeah, I did. I wrote it down and I texted to anybody who would listen.
Okay, so what was it?
So my prediction was Trump with the win. I thought that Kamala Harris was going to lose Georgia, that she was going to win Pennsylvania, that she was going to lose Michigan, that she was going to lose Arizona, that she was going to win Nevada by a razor margin, that she was going to lose North Carolina. I'm trying to think of what is the other, that the big toss up for me was Wisconsin. And I thought that I was leaning towards her losing Wisconsin. The surprise for me came with, not the surprise. Actually, yes, the surprise came with Pennsylvania. I didn't realize that she would lose Pennsylvania and would lose Pennsylvania by that much. But
so I guess my question for you then is, so your Monday self thought this was going to be a razor thin margin. Maybe she got the popular vote and lost the electoral vote. So what are you now thinking that you didn't quite weight heavily enough in your Monday self that you've learned since then that now you're going to be trying to think through in the days and weeks to come? That's a consequence of the world giving us some facts about what the actual scale of the result was. What have you learned and what are you going to be chewing on?
So the scale of grievance populism and how incredibly popular grievance populism is, and that it extends beyond simply Donald Trump being the aggrieved party. That somehow one of the things that Trump was able to do really quite effectively, and he had a lot of things on his side, but one of the things that he was able to do quite effectively was create a multiracial, multi-ethnic coalition of grievance populism that resulted in a powerful show of force at the polls. And I think that it's not just me that has to think about this. I think that this is something that we all have to think about. But I will say that, and there are elements to this that surely we can tease out, and I'm sure the audience wants to tease out, but, Latino voters, Donald Trump getting the highest number of Latino voters from a Republican, beating out even George W. Bush, who was quite popular with Latino voters, but giving of any Republican in the modern period. He does about the same with Black voters, but in very specific areas, particularly battleground states. He doubles his percentage of support amongst Black male voters. So thinking about how did a candidate who was distinctly aggrieved and aggravated turn his personal frustrations into something that resonated with a wide swath of the American population. The other thing that I will point out, and it's directly correlated with this, and I think Lily probably has a lot to say about this, is that on paper, it also appears that he was able to convince a wide cross section of the American public, even in states that Kamala Harris won, that they too had been wronged, left behind, and were aggrieved. Because what we see is that even in New York, even in New Jersey, even in Maryland, Connecticut, California, these are hard blue states, that there was a rightward switch movement amongst the American electorate. So the real question for me moving forward is that a permanent shift, rightward switch, or is it a reflection of the moment in time that we are in right now? I actually think it's the latter, but we can talk about that later.
Yeah, we should move on to Lily, but I do want to pick up this theme of grievance because I think that theme maybe underspecifies what we mean by grievance. Is it the content of the grievance, or one other way to think about it is it the genre of grievance, right? That is, grievance is both a style of politics and it's also a sort of specification of a thing that one is aggrieved about. And we may want to pick up on how much that's playing a role in these. So Lily, I want you to do the Wayback Machine now, back to your Monday self. What did you imagine you were going to be saying today on Thursday, back on Monday?
Yeah. So unlike Leah, I was very wrong about what I was expecting. I expected to see either a close or a not close Harris victory. And now hearing Leah talk about, the sort of all of the historical signs were pointing away from that outcome. And I think the reason that I was looking towards that outcome was that what I expected to see was something similar to 2022 in the sense of women and pro-abortion access votes being undercounted in the polls, and the sort of the existence of shy Harris voters potentially, partly because of research I've been doing looking at this real rift in the Republican Party that is still there. It exists between Republicans who are really into what Trump represents, and that's about 2/3 of the party, versus about 1/3 of the party that really doesn't like what Trump has been doing. And I did expect that there was a possibility that some of that third of the Republican Party might secretly vote for Harris, based on individual interviews with people, and based on survey data that we've been collecting at Agora over the last year. So I also expected, in the event of a Harris victory, I expected to see a lot of legal challenges to the outcome from the Republican Party. We know from news coverage that was all ready to go, and was in the works. I expected to see, in the event of a Harris victory, potentially violent responses from average Trump supporters in the electorate, potentially militia activity, and activity around the certification of the election in the states, rather than something like January 6th, which was sort of like, as they learned, too late to overturn the 2020 election. And instead we see what we saw, which I think is digging more into this idea of grievance politics, a real demonstration of, particularly among men, of a pretty strong backlash politics to a lot of the progress that we've made as a country over the last few decades, both racially and in terms of gender equality and LGBTQ rights. We saw a real backlash to that from the electorate. And that's partly because the Republican Party spent a lot of money reminding voters that the real threat was, boys playing in girls' sports, and really vilifying trans kids, and reminding men about the grievances they have about women. And that message seemed to really come through. And we saw that the kind of anti-Trump Republicans, when it came down to it, they were loyal, right? They stuck with the Republican Party. They voted for Trump. They didn't defect when it was in the privacy of the voting booth, which I think tells us something about both party loyalty, partisan identity, but also kind of knowing, this idea of knowing that something is wrong and still doing it anyway. We have a very calcified political system, and that system was definitely maintained. And we also didn't see we haven't seen any election denial activity coming from the Republican Party. So clearly the concerns about the election were not really about the election. And instead it was about the sort of whether or not they could maintain power, which obviously the Republican Party really has not only held on to power, partly because of lack of Democratic Party enthusiasm, as Leah was discussing. But I do want to add one more thing here, is that this result is actually very consistent with a global anti-incumbent movement that we've been seeing in all of the elections, particularly this year, but also sort of post-COVID. We've seen a real rejection of incumbents all over the world. And in fact, according to the data right now, we don't obviously have final vote count data, but according to the data right now, it looks like the Democratic Party actually lost by less than most incumbents across sort of Western democracies in this year's elections. So there also is something going on that's just this, response to inflation, response to the trauma of COVID that I think the whole world is still trying to process. Fear of uncertainty. When we are uncertain, we tend to go towards a strongman leader. And there's a lot of uncertainty over the last 4 years that we've just had to deal with and haven't really explicitly dealt with. So it's also consistent with this kind of global movement that we're not independent of.
Yeah, can I ask just a quick follow-up on that, Lily, which is there's a couple of theories that are embedded in what you just said that I think are worth kind of pulling the thread on. So when we put it in the global context, so my wife is British, I pay a lot of attention to British politics. One of the things they always have at night on the elections is this swingometer where they talk about what the national vote's going to be and then how much that's going to create a swing in individual districts. And then you can see which constituencies are going to move over. And one of the arguments you can make about this is this was a kind of just general swing election, right? That there wasn't a lot of idiosyncrasy across different states, across different districts. It was almost just a uniform switch over the whole thing, every state. But one story you could actually tell, and you were getting at this just now, is the surprise that Trump won, or is the surprise that Trump won by as little as he did? So this is, Matt Iglesias had a piece where he was saying, why is this race so close? And the reason he was asking that is all of the structural things that Leah was talking about earlier would actually point to a pretty big loss, right? I mean, again, I think your point about COVID, which we might want to talk about a little bit, that I feel like that's a kind of suppressed factor that just generated lots of anti-system alienation that people couldn't figure out something specifically to do about. They couldn't get angry at the specific school district that closed up and made them get holed up with their kids for a year. And so it just got directed at the system as a whole. And this was the first opportunity for a really big system reaction. So I guess the question is, were the specifically Trump factors that you mentioned actually a drag or an accelerator of this result? Did they actually subtract from Republican results, or did they add to it? So you mentioned, that in these conditions, people reach out for a strongman leader. Or was it the case that actually a generic Republican would have done better than Trump, subtracting the strongman things just by saying, hey, I'm just like every other leader in every other democracy. I have no characteristics whatsoever. I'm just the other party. Would that have actually been more successful? And that gets at how much we want to actually talk about how much this matters about Trump and how much some of the structural stuff we're talking about is significant here.
Yeah, I mean, so from the data that I've seen so far, it looks like the rightward shift was the smallest in the places where the campaigns were focused. And so it does seem like campaigning itself minimized the rightward shift, right? So getting a lot of information, a lot of attention from these campaigns minimized the shift. We don't know which campaign did it, right? But it does seem like getting more information in front of voters kind of prevented a bigger shift towards the Republican Party. And we don't know whether that's because of Trump himself being unpalatable and the Democratic campaign putting him front and center, or whether it's because in these, I guess, just getting information about the things that are really happening. I mean, I think another thing that we saw is this, and this is all over the world too, is this sort of we've had a loss of a shared truth in general. And so it's hard to know which, which messages are getting through because everyone's getting different messages. And so this sort of strongman thing and the grievance stuff, like all of this is very clearly it's happening and it's working and it's getting to certain groups of people, but it's very hard for us to know anymore what the common set of facts are that everybody is supposed to be working off of.
Yeah, and this is one thing I guess I'll throw it to both of you before we go into comments. Almost neither one of you has really talked about the content of what the Biden administration did as having a causal impact on the result here. But we did have 4 years of Biden administration governance. And do we think that that played any consequential role in the result that we're seeing, right? People argue, well, that's the inflation that was the result of Biden fiscal policy. It was the social policy. It was that they only got around to immigration control at the end of the administration rather than the beginning. Did any of that sort of the actual content of governance, do you think, play into this result, or did it just not matter what the Biden administration did for the last 4 years? Leah, do you want to start, and then we'll go to Lily?
Sure. This is a cop-out answer, but it did and it didn't matter. So on the one hand, one of the things that we've seen over the past 4 years is that the economy has just made a spectacular recovery on paper, right? Including, as of right now, inflation has stopped, right? Unemployment and underemployment is at record lows. The only thing that hasn't really adjusted, the price of homes and people's wages have not adjusted to meet kind of the needs of inflation. But these are some of the things that Kamala Harris had promised to address in her opportunity agenda. And certainly one of the things that I think that within this larger kind of democratic world that people really complained about is that that Kamala Harris's campaign, but also the Biden administration, very rarely touted their accomplishments. So very rarely touted their economic accomplishments, very rarely touted their climate change accomplishments, very rarely touted their infrastructure, even their border control and immigration things. And so ultimately what happens, these different silos of information determine what the narrative is going to be on Biden. I will give you guys just a really quick example. Donald Trump, as he is leaving office, Congress passes the stimulus relief, COVID stimulus relief bill, where everybody gets those stimulus checks. Donald Trump says, I'm going to veto it, but it passes in Congress with a veto-proof majority. So he has no choice but to sign the act into law. What does he do? Does anybody remember what he does? He goes and he says, I want my name to be on the stimulus checks, right? And everybody laughs. They say, that's stupid. This is what an arrogant, narcissistic thing to do. Well, you know what it does? People remember those checks and they say, Donald Trump gave me $1,200. They do not remember that in the second round, Joe Biden gives them $1,200, except that Joe Biden doesn't give it. The Secretary of the Treasury signs that check. And so I think that's just a really quick example of the part of the problem around narratives of the Biden administration accomplishments, which is that they allowed other people to talk about their policy accomplishments and thus create a narrative around those accomplishments that didn't necessarily jive with the truth. It's also true that, again, that point I made about it not necessarily matching up with the reality of experiences on the ground. The number one concern of people who voted for Donald Trump was the economy. They said that they were not better now than they had been 4 years earlier. That is a wild statistic, given that the economy was in the trash 4 years ago, and that we were still in the thick of COVID. Thousands of people were dying per day. So for people to have that impression, right? One, it says this is what they're experiencing right now, but it also tells us that the narrative around the legislation is very, very important. Now, the one other thing that I think that is really important is that the Biden administration took a very interesting approach to militarization and foreign policy. And I think that was to disastrous effects. I think that is one piece of legislation that the Biden administration deeply underestimated and had no coherent policy or coherent messaging because their actions could not be interpreted in a different way. So certainly there's Ukraine. The majority of Americans do not understand why the United States is funding a war in Ukraine. They just can't understand it. And sitting down and having a policy conversation about the importance of democracy in Ukraine and preventing Russian interference and Russian aggression is not going to jive with the majority of Americans. And then, of course, there is Israel and Gaza. And I think the Biden administration was put in a very, very tough situation, very tough scenario, where there were very few clear paths out of that scenario. The Trump campaign was able to take advantage of that. In the closing days of the campaign, they campaigned on both a pro-Palestinian platform and a pro-Israel platform. And the key there was that they spoke to those different audiences. And because those audiences were not talking with one another, they could have that conversation very aggressively. And of course, you make campaign promises, and then the second that you get elected, you throw them all out the window, which is what we're seeing with Donald Trump. So I think that these are a couple areas where when we think about the Biden administration, both the lack of messaging and the lack of communication around the policy agenda, but also the very specific policies that did end up breaking through had a detrimental impact overall on the legacy of the Biden administration and how it played out in the campaign.
Yeah, Lily, actually, can I ask you a slightly different question, which is to go back to something you were saying before, again, about your expectations and how the results, right? And Leah was actually asking about this in the chat. There were a number of places where there did seem to be ticket splitting on abortion, right? So some people were voting for referenda for abortion rights, and they were voting for Trump. Clearly, the Democratic campaign thought the overturning of Roe was going to be, an absolutely super powerful issue for them. And they leaned very heavily into that, arguably at the expense of other kind of things they could have been doing with their time. In retrospect, was that an error? And what is it that may have caused that issue to be less potent than at least lots of Democratic campaign people thought it was going to be?
Yeah, so I don't think it was an error. And part of this is that, first of all, it made sense based on the 2022 election results, right? We saw exactly the same type of behavior in 2022. We saw women coming out and voting for abortion access, even when they voted for Republicans. And so that is consistent with what we saw in the last midterm election. So I don't think that it wasn't a mistake. It was based on very good information, I think. I guess the way that I think about the effect of Dobbs is that because we are in such different information environments, the people that Trump was speaking to believed that he wouldn't remove access to abortion. That was his story the entire time. It wasn't a story of one party that wants to take abortion away from you and the other party that wants to make sure that you can preserve your right to have it. The story that was told by the Trump campaign was you can still have abortion, right? Or even admitting that it's gone in some places was I'm leaving it to the states to decide. And even that sounds like it's still an option, right? And a lot of the kind of the news sources that certainly Republicans tend to consume were not saying anything about abortion or the threat to abortion rights or abortion access anywhere in the country. It wasn't part of that argument. And so to the extent that Democrats try to make it a part of the campaign, they just can't speak to a lot of Republican voters anymore, or even independent voters who don't pay a lot of attention to politics. And then the third thing is that the mainstream media haven't really been putting this on the front page the way that they did in 2022. And so things like, every once in a while we have like a blockbuster New York Times article about one woman who either died or was deeply harmed by lack of abortion care. But it's not, there wasn't any kind of drumbeat about that, the way that we saw drumbeats about Biden's age, about the economy, about immigration, right? Those types of stories were just so much more prevalent, even in, supposedly left-leaning mainstream media. And so we just weren't hearing the same story that we were in 2022.
Yeah, so I actually promised Amy not to have any editorial comments, but I'm going to break my rule for just 60 seconds. which is just on the abortion thing. The thing that's striking about Trump is how willing he was to actually really poke his own coalition in the side on abortion, right? That is, and again, you've seen this over and over again, going back to 2016, right? The 2016 Republicans were all in on austerity, on cutting entitlements. And Trump, because he wasn't really as connected to his own coalition as in a way Democrats are, right? If Kamala Harris is anything, she's a very much connected to that old coalition of who Democrats are. And the last thing that was in her repertoire was attacking her own coalition or undermining her own coalition. But Trump seemed totally willing to do that, and there may be a lesson there. So we should go into the questions. We've talked a little bit about the global context already, but we have a question about putting the election in a global context, about from Claudia about that we're experiencing a swing toward conservative administrations coming to power. Do you think that it's actually a swing toward conservative administrations or governments, or is it just anti-incumbency? Is it just that whoever's in power is going to be unpopular because there's this general diffuse anti-system energy that's going to be directed at who's ever in control? Leah and Lily?
Sure. So I think one, this is something that we have to we have to pay really close attention to. But I am actually of the mind that this is not something that is static, that this is something that has a lot of malleability and is deeply flexible. And I would point both to, within the global context, but also within the domestic context, there was a willingness on the part, and there continues to be a willingness in global politics to essentially split the ticket. So to split the ticket in terms of supporting, say, maybe a right-wing candidate like Donald Trump, but then to vote down ballot. And you saw, in 3 states that went for Trump, we saw abortion rights were enshrined and encoded in law. We saw in North Carolina, for example, we saw the governor, the lieutenant governor, and the attorney general were all Democrats, right? We saw we're seeing these things that are indicators that this may not be a permanent fixture. Now, certainly there is an element, I think, that is cultural, and cultural is much harder to dismantle, right? If it's just purely economic, then you can say, okay, well, we put economic things in place. But if it's cultural, culture is a little bit harder. And I think the combination of global austerity politics mixed with a rapidly changing global sentiment around borders and kind of the porosity of borders, and then our unwillingness globally to deal with the mass consequences of the pandemic, has led to this very real anger on the part of global citizenry that they are taking out fundamentally on their politicians and their political institutions. I know there's a lot of pushback from people who say, oh, I'm so sick of that like economic grievance. I'm sick of like people saying, well, they don't feel heard and they feel left behind. But actually, I think that we need to examine that, and we need to really say, well, it is relatively easy to move in with certain kinds of populist movements, global movements, particularly if people are feeling anxiety, whether it be anxiety about being replacement theory, right? Economic insolvency, right? Or, food insolvency, these kinds of things, to move in with someone who perhaps doesn't have solution, but has pays attention, and then says, I'm going to offer you things that look like solutions, but are actually scapegoats. And so that is very different from an opposition party, a weak opposition party, that is the incumbency in this case, that has spent perhaps a lot of time, even as they may have policies and agendas that maybe speak to these things, but have spent a lot of time saying, well, at least I'm not that guy or that girl, right? Because that doesn't effectively get to the structural root of what people are expressing. And so I do think, again, that there is a fringe wing of this, that can't be disturbed, that this is very much a very ugly, rightward global phenomenon. But I think the vast majority of what we are seeing are people that are malleable, that are flexible, but are feeling a kind of uncertainty, particularly coming out of this really just global revolutionary pandemic, and want to make a statement, want to make
Yeah,
a powerful statement.
can I sharpen the international question for Lily a little bit? That when we're talking about populism, right, people often throw a lot of stuff into that word, and you never know quite what people mean by it. But one thing that was really striking about the Harris campaign, and again, this may have been a consequence of trying to put together a campaign in just a couple of months and not really being able to sharpen a message in the way that you would have done over primary after primary and debate after debate, where you kind of do that. But it did strike me that Harris, whether intentionally or not, did come off as the candidate of the institutions. And that's partially a consequence of the fact that the Democratic Party is now the party of the institutions, of universities and professions and science and expertise. And is it the case that under those conditions, given what the parties are, right, that the Democratic Party is now the party of professions and institutions and expertise, that in a moment when there's a lot of international suspicion of institutions, right, some of that goes back to COVID. People blame COVID on the experts who, got them locked up in their house. They blame the experts who got us into the Iraq War, the experts who got us into 2008 financial crisis. Is that just going to be a durable feature of our politics? That this sense that experts don't know as much as they claim to know, that the idea that we should defer to them as a basic feature of governance is a kind of thing of the past? Is it a problem that Democrats are sort of, and many left parties are viewed as the party of expertise in an anti-expert, anti-institutional period?
Yeah. I mean, I think so. Part of it is this sort of anti-institutional sentiment, like you were talking about. But I think that there's something else going on with the anti-institutional movement, which is that institutions have to play by different rules than rogue actors or extremist groups. And so a lot of this is, I think, institutions being used as scapegoats because they don't really fight back. And so not only are institutions being scapegoated, but they also have to obey their own rules about, inclusion and diversity and freedom of speech and pluralism, right? Most of our institutions, for the better, have committed to, some common rules about how we figure out what's true, who we include in our conversations, who's allowed to speak. And I think a lot of the turn against institutions is partly because their rules don't let them fight back in a way that, for example, an OAN news network can fight. And that includes the New York Times and the Washington Post. And, these sort of institutional forces, they're polite and they play by the rules. That's part of it. But the other reason for attacking institutions is that we know from research on extremist groups is that the people who are feeling uncertain and anxious and not sure what's coming next and where they fit in the world's status hierarchy are really attracted to extremist groups. And that includes hate groups, even though it's not necessarily being motivated by hate, it's being motivated by certainty, right? An extremist group has very strict boundaries and very clear rules of engagement, and they exclude huge numbers of people, and that exclusion provides certainty for folks. So a lot of the exclusion that we're seeing coming from the right is also really attractive to people who don't know what's going on.
Yeah, can I ask you this question? We've only got 1 minute left, and I just want to throw one last question to Leah that pivots off of what Lily was just talking about, which is there's a number of questions in the chat about the information environment of campaigns. What some people in the chat are talking, Michelle is talking about the idea that we have a propaganda machine that's out there. Can we envision that the context of our political campaigns will be will be going on in a more consensual information environment in the future, or is this
No.
simply the environment that all of our politics is going to operate in the, from going forward to just in maybe in a minute?
I would assume that going forward, all of our politics are going to operate in essentially a silo of misinformation. And so I think part of, I mean, anyone just sign on to X/Twitter, and it's a free for all. It's the wild, wild west. There's also far more mediums for people to get information from. So traditional metrics of how people get their information, how people get their news, how people get their expertise, particularly with the development of AI, just means we are going to continue to have this culture of misinformation. But that doesn't necessarily mean that we have to allow that to dictate where we go. And I think one of the things that has come across very clearly is that when you have real world contacts with people, campaigns in particular, but also democracies, that actually has far more power than something that someone reads on the internet. So moving forward, for anyone who genuinely cares about a culture, I think, of democracy, of democratic engagement, it can't unfortunately be behind the computer. It has to be actual, tangible engagement. And in fact, what I would argue is this is actually where the Harris campaign veered in the wrong direction in the closing weeks of the campaign, which is they moved from this kind of really broad, expansive ground game where they were touching all kinds of people to one that was very insular and focused on very traditional mediums of engagement. So think Saturday Night Live, think rallies with likely voters and things of that nature. You actually have to get out there and talk and engage with people in the flesh, right? In real life, if you want to hold them to your side.
Thank you guys so much. So this is the end of part one. I want to really thank my dear colleagues, Lily and Leah, for a great discussion, which I think hopefully got us all a little bit up the information curve on where we were coming out of the past. And I think the next session, we're going to talk a bit about where we might be going from here. Amy?
Thanks, Steve. Thank you, Lily and Leah. It's been wonderful. We'll see you all in 5 minutes. Welcome back to our audience. For those of you who are just tuning in, my name is Amy Binder, and I am SNF Agora Professor of Sociology at Johns Hopkins and host of today's two-part discussion on the 2024 U.S. general election. If you missed the first half of our program, we looked back to discuss some of the root causes of the current political climate in America. And we'll now take a look ahead and discuss the impact this week's election will have on the future of American politics. Joining Steve Teles for this discussion are two experts, Eugene Scott and Soren Dayton. Once again, we'll keep these intros brief in the interest of time. So Eugene Scott is an award-winning journalist who has spent 2 decades covering politics at the local, national, and international levels. He's currently a host at Axios Live, where he travels the country interviewing political and policy leaders, and he's also a fellow at the Harvard Institute of Politics. Eugene previously worked as a senior political reporter for Axios, covering 2024 swing voters and voting rights, and was a national political reporter at the Washington Post, focused on identity politics and the 2022 midterm election. Soren Dayton is the director of governance at the Niskanen Center, where he focuses on developing and implementing institutional reforms and practices to deliver more effective government. He previously led institutional reform efforts at Protect Democracy and had worked on John McCain's campaign for president and multiple Republican leadership campaigns in Congress and party organizations, including as executive director of the Young Republican National Federation. He is currently a 2023-24 Democracy Fellow with the Center for Effective Government at the University of Chicago. So thank you, Eugene and Soren, for joining us online today. And Steve, thank you so much for sticking around, and you can take it away.
Yes. So again, I'm honored to have Eugene and Soren here. Soren in particular, who is a fellow at America's finest think tank, the Niskanen Center. So there's my little exercise of bias where I'm a senior fellow. So I wanted to start out this in the first session. The question we began with in trying to model a kind of spirit of fallibility is to imagine yourself in the Wayback Machine. That today you were going to talk about how the election was going to affect governance going forward. How not looking backwards but looking forwards. On Monday, what did you imagine you were going to be telling us about how things were going to be going forward, and how did the election change now where you think we're going to be going, both in American politics and policy? So, Eugene, you want to start out?
Sure. Had we spoken Monday, I would have told you that I believed that Trump won, but I did not think he was going to get the popular vote. And the reason I thought he was going to win, because based on my reporting, too many individuals in the demographic groups that Democrats rely on were telling me that they were actually voting for Trump. So I knew that Harris did not have the support she needed to be victorious. I thought she'd get the popular vote, though, based on what we've seen in the last two elections. And so what I was wrong about is that most Americans casting ballots casted one for Trump. That was very surprising to me.
Can I just ask you, if you're trying to imagine, all of us are in a constant process of both making predictions and then hopefully updating our beliefs based on information, right? That's at least how we like to imagine ourselves, that we have thoughts, we have theories, and then we update them. So what is it you think that you got wrong, at least about your worldview or how you thought about the United States, that caused you to underestimate the degree of support for Trump? And how might you be having to think about the electorate and American politics differently going forward?
Well, I think a couple of things. I probably thought that more people who tend to vote Democrat were frustrated with the Harris campaign and agenda. More or less, were going to hold their nose and vote for her, and that did not happen. I also thought that fear of a Trump return would motivate more people who don't like him to vote against him than actually was the case. And I probably thought that more people were going to be put off by his actions and the indecency and the fear of a more authoritarian government than actually was the case.
Yeah, let's just ask one more question before I get to Soren. Again, getting at this sort of, how do you think you're going to have to update going forward? I wrote a whole book called Never Trump that was about Republicans who opposed Trump in 2016 and afterward. And, that was the group of people who most were not willing to hold their nose and vote for Trump despite being Republicans. But one thought is actually maybe it just turns out that large parts of the electorate just don't care about the things that maybe people like us generally tend to think are repulsive about Trump. And do you think there's something to that? Do you think that this is actually a less generalizable phenomenon about who Americans are, that the kind of things that bother us don't bother most Americans?
No, I've been giving that a lot of thought and been in a number of conversations about that. I think there are a couple of things. Conversations about decency have changed due to postmodernism and moral relativism. I think a mistake that Hillary Clinton made was just really having perhaps too much confidence in the Democratic Party being a moral authority on that issue, and Trump supporters caring about that more than they cared about bread and butter issues. And I think zooming in on Trump as if he is the cause opposed to a symptom of a culture that has higher tolerance for indecency was a miscalculation. I think a takeaway from 2020 might be an incorrect takeaway from 2020 might be that Biden was more effective at communicating that idea, when the reality is that it's not why a lot of people voted for Biden. And so I think just really talking about behavior, number one, just it's a harder sell to make in a world, in a country whose values just have shifted from the 90s and even years before for a host of reasons. But even if they had not, even if people really did have a problem with the profanity and the name calling and mimicking fellatio in a speech, the reality is there are too many voters who are far less concerned about that than they are about their rent going up, the cost of eggs going up, higher education being incredibly unaffordable, and so many other issues like that that are affecting voters day to day.
Yeah, there's a whole bunch of things. Some of them I want to like pull on that string a little bit later, also because Amy is on this. I do think there's a really interesting sociological dynamic, especially around these ideas of propriety and who can govern propriety, and that's actually a consequential part of what's going on between the two parties, and the two parties are not neutral on that difference. But let's actually pause on that. Soren, go back again to Monday. What did you think you were going to tell us about what American politics was going to be like going forward, and how are you now having to update based on what actually happened on Tuesday?
So I thought it was going to be more of a muddle. I didn't have a very strong point of view about who was going to win the presidency. But I thought we were going to come out, with something that felt more like a divided decision. And the House is still up for grabs, but I think it's clear, when you look at the maps, I don't think were used in quite the same way in previous years, where like the individual counties, just they're all red and up to the right. And I think the broad base of Donald Trump support across demographics, maybe with the exception of college educated people represented on this call, and both here in the both us in the audience. I think that's the, I guess I would say what happened was in the realm of my possibilities, but I didn't think it would be so stark. Right. And so for me, I think the questions that come out of this, and I think most of the interesting questions in a time like this actually get formed sort of in the sort of intra-party warfare that will take place. What is the Democrat story that they tell themselves? What is the Republican story they tell themselves? I think those are going to get, we are potentially in very different worlds than we were a couple of days ago as people wrestle with the facts that we now have, that the voters shared with us yesterday or Tuesday.
So I want to actually just again go even further back in the Wayback Machine, back to 2016. And so when I was writing this book, Never Trump, one of the things that a lot of people were saying is that lots of people were never Trump, in part because they just all expected Trump to lose. And so they thought, oh, okay, Trump's going to lose, and then we will have said we were against it, and we will have warned everybody. So then when he does, we can say, well, look, here's what happens when you don't listen to us, the reasonable people in the room. So you should give us all the power back, and we'll just pretend that that never happened. So, you could imagine, on Monday, thinking, oh, well, maybe Trump's going to lose. And then finally, we will have, after the failures of 2020 and the failures of 2022, that there'll be a sort of return of the repressed normal Republican, and we'll be back to that environment. But we're clearly not there. So can you tell us a little bit about what you imagine the Republican Party is going to look like going forward based on the lessons that they're drawing from the results of this election?
Well, first of all, these are contested, right? And they've been contested for a while. I think in some ways, the old Republican Party, uh, you know, maybe started to disappear in 2008 or 2010, and we're still working through that process, right? But I think among the questions that people are going to wrestle with are um, what policies do Republicans have to give to these more economically downscale voters that are increasingly the base of their party, and how do they reconcile those policies with where they've been in the past? And this is, you could understand the pick of JD Vance at, and I don't think this is entirely correct, but you could understand it as putting a thumb on one side of that scale. And I think certainly his presence in the White House will mean that a kind of more populist economic argument will have more power. Now, what does that mean when it comes to votes on tariffs? If there are votes on tariffs, God only knows. I don't know. We're going to find out in the conflict when it gets there. And both Republicans and Democrats are going to have say on those votes. It won't just be one party gets to make that decision. But I think so I think that's a set of issues. I also think there'll be a set of questions that sort of get more to this sort of proprietariness kinds of discussion we were having. How do you feel about, and I'm being flippant here and slightly unserious in my characterization, the cat eating discourse, right? Like, I know plenty of people who think JD Vance and Donald Trump's statements about cat eating in Springfield were political winners, and I know a bunch that think they're political losers. But I think how you answer that question is going to make some it's going to determine how you act in the future. And I think that one's up for grabs. And right now, I think the people that think the cat eating comments were winners are going to win that fight in the Republican Party. Now, where does that take us? I'm not sure, but making a more exaggerated argument to get to make a point, that's something you can do.
Yeah, this actually, I think, gets at something that Eugene was saying and that came up in the last panel, which is the thinking about what the parties are in relationship to what we might just think of as institutions more broadly. So if you were going back to when at least Soren was when college back in the Paleolithic age, the Republicans, lots of Republicans were, the people who ran institutions, or who were at least highly represented in them. And part of when we talk about the realignment, we often talk about a realignment of mass voters, but one of the most consequential realignments of the last 30 to 40 years is the realignment of elites, institutions, experts, science, that to a large degree, the Democratic coalition today is massively disproportionately represented by professionals, university professors, experts, all those people who, to some degree, are the enforcers of propriety, right? They're the ones who care about manners, right? In a way that, back in the day, we would have thought, oh, it was actually people on the left who were the ones who were into violating manners and dirty talk and all that other kind of stuff. That was considered to be a left kind of vibe. But can you talk a little bit about this institutional realignment, where to some degree the Republican Party now has in it this whole set of people who actually don't just think they have to hold their nose in violations of propriety, but now that's what they want, right? They actually don't trust these institutions that they associate with the Democratic Party. And they are, in fact, affirmatively attracted to having someone who can actually poke those institutions in the eye. Eugene, do you want to just pick up on that and run with it?
Yeah, I think what I'm interested in seeing, I had a session yesterday with my students, and I was reminded of how hard this outcome can be for an 18 or 20-year-old if this is not who you wanted to win, in ways that I think a lot of folks I know who were against Trump, but are older and have seen the world a bit, are perhaps not feeling. And part of the reason I think I was encouraging them not to be as alarmist, and I think Soren kind of got to this, is in many ways, we really do not know what will happen. I think the president has put forward an agenda and ideas, and he has said some things he'll do. But the reality is that he's not a king. And not only do Republican lawmakers, including Republicans who support him, which are the overwhelming majority of people in Congress, not only do they have to work with the Democrats, they have to work with each other. And I still think there's not been enough attention paid to diversity that still exists within the GOP about how to respond to many of the issues that people are concerned about. I think the rise of the Never Trump movement makes people think that everyone who has issues with, the cat eating comments has left the GOP, but the reality is that's not true. And something I've noticed in the last, I guess, day, is there are a lot of different wings in the GOP who think this victory means different things, and that they have the freedom to move forward with whatever they think the GOP should be. And I think people are going to be in for a rude awakening. One of the words I've heard repeatedly after Trump, I think one of the things that as I said, I was surprised about him winning the popular vote. And as a result, I think there are people in Trump's camp who believe because the majority of people who voted for him, he has a mandate. He has a mandate to move forward. But the reality is different people voted for him for different reasons. And so moving forward on one accord, it's going to be much more difficult, I think, for Trump world than people think. And I think there's some things that people are wrapping this up. I think there are some things that people are hoping and maybe even sure that he's going to do that he might not necessarily do at all, or will have a very difficult time doing.
Yeah, so at Niskanen, we count on Soren as our Republican congressional whisperer. So whenever we want to know, like, what are Republicans actually thinking in Congress, we go up to the Oracle and he tells us what's going on. So can you actually just play off of that question or the things that Eugene was saying? How much diversity do you think there is among congressional Republicans? How much are they going to feel like they have to, especially given the scale of Trump's victory, that they have to bend the knee, that they're not going to be able to resist Trump's some of his more extreme things, the Schedule F and all of those kind of things. Can you tell us a little bit about where you think congressional Republicans are now and where they're going to look like in relationship to Trump's governance going forward?
Mm-hmm. Well, maybe as a way to sort of go back to your first question, had Trump lost, one of my hot takes was going to be that Mitch McConnell, who, the much derided Mitch McConnell, will have passed off the leadership of the Senate Republicans to John Thune, who was the most anti-Trump person in Republican leadership in the Senate. Now, he may still, right? That may yet still happen. But I think you've got a set of humans, at the leadership of the Senate party, at least, who are pretty hostile to Trump in private and really want to govern, right? And one of my favorite moments of the last 4 years, and where you can see this, was the debate in the Senate Rules Committee when they were voting on the Electoral Count Reform Act. And Ted Cruz, who was the only no vote, it was a 14-1, was saying something. And Senator Shelby from Alabama was looking at him like, who are you, you space alien? Right? I mean, it was just like a complete disconnect. And I think, so I think you're going to have a set of people who, and I would say it's a good chunk of the leadership, and you will probably find that, my guess is Thune or Cornyn wins that with 60% of the Senate Republicans vote, right? So the person who wants to do the style of Trump probably can only get a third or maybe 40% of the Senate Republicans. That tells you that there's a bunch of support somewhere else. Now, where does that go? How does that get organized? This is probably a family-friendly call, so I won't share one of my favorite quotes about what someone said they wanted to do to Trump, as long as Trump never found out. But I'll let you fill in the gaps there. So you have a set of people that will be sort of instinctively against him, but not sure how to do that. You'll have a set of people that still cares about what the business community thinks. Here's where I think the tariff fights will be really, really interesting. You'll have a set of people who are really, who are frankly in cycle for this election. So Tom Tillis, I have no idea what Tom Tillis is going to say because he's afraid of his primaries. And so you're going to go through you have to do that. You have to do a set of analyses. But I think there's a bunch of people who still to this day are very nervous about what Trump's up to and think they can live past it. Now, that may be wrong, right? Again, that would have been my easy analysis hot take had Harris won. That I don't think quite works, and I haven't figured out what it means yet. But I don't know if that's some of an answer to your question.
Yeah.
That sort of some of the pieces. Yeah.
Yeah. Eugene, were you trying to get in on that?
Yeah, and I was going to say to Soren's point, comments which may have been implied, but to make clear to people who don't understand, one of the reasons why it's not everybody is just going to be fully on board. In addition to values and worldview and ideology, is that for some of these folks, next year's the start of an election year. And the reality is, I've told so many people, the young people, it's like, for those who are unhappy, midterms start next year. And the reality is, from some of these folks, they start now, right? I like to say every year it's an election year, but I feel like that triggers people and this traumatizing for some folks. So, but the reality is, there are people. I mean, if you spend some time looking at the results of different races, there are people in races who barely got back to Washington, and they cannot lean into Trumpism the way that some people who really have leaned into it and remain in Washington. And that's always going to be true, and that is going to continue to be true.
Yeah, I want to go back to something that Soren said that I want to kind of just unpack for the amount of time we got here, which is to think a little bit surgically about those areas where congressional Republicans will just support Trump versus where we think the areas with the highest probability of opposition. So Soren's already said that tariffs are one of those. That's one where this question of how much this Trump coalition is backward compatible with the old Republican, right? Lots of these Republicans came out of a Republican Party that thought of itself as having business as a kind of anchor tenant. And is it possible that you think that Trump will just accept that lots of business is going to leave the Republican Party and that they'll pick up enough working class party voters to be okay with lots of business just ending up in the Democratic Party? Where do you think the sort of role of business is going to be going forward? And do you think that, especially with you mentioned J.D. Vance, that with Vance as vice president, that the Republican Party is just going to accept that swap, less business support, but more working class support among voters?
I think this is one of the jump balls that we're not going to know. And frankly, trade has divided both parties in more interesting ways for the last 20 years than I think we normally give it credit for. In many ways, some of the most pro-trade voters in America have been Latinos, right? And that's there's all sorts of reasons for that. So how will business handle it? Well, business has tariffs, taxes, regulation, all as things on the table. And I think they may get what they want on, say, corporate tax rates and regulation, but not on tariffs, right? There's ways to split that baby, as it were, that I think the Trump people are very, very smart about. But I do think there is a long-term trajectory question. If you're working in um, a high skill information, uh, you know, uh, a high skill industry, I think those people are going Democrat fast, right? Like I remember big advertising companies paid for paid for buses and hotels for the Women's March for their employees, publicly traded companies, right? Because they knew what their employees wanted, and ultimately that's one of their most important stakeholders. So I think it's going to very much depend on who your workforce is in some of these and where the policy lands. If you're in a extraction industry, which can include agriculture, can include mining and all sorts of things, I think you're gonna have very strong reasons to like Trump. And if you're in a high information, a high skill information economy, you're going to have very strong reasons to support the Democrats.
Yeah, Eugene, I wanted to
Indeed.
ask you
Yeah.
again.
Oh, I was just saying, indeed, depends on who you're trying to attract.
Yeah, I was thinking that going forward, we were talking a little bit about this changing coalitional dynamic of the Republican Party. And one of those stories I often tell people is that parties are affected not just by who their voters already are, but who they imagine their voters might be in the future. And if you're imagining how the Republican Party thinks of its own future, one thought is it imagines itself as having a significant number, at least of Hispanic voters, which is a big grab bag of a category. And part of me thinks that we should actually just totally eliminate that category because it's such a mess and doesn't tell us anything. And it's often used as a parallel for the African American category, which it really isn't. But how much Eugene, do you think that the Republican Party's behavior on some of these issues is going to change by what you might call its racial imaginary shifting, right? It's imagination of who its voters might be in the future and who might be additional voters, not just who they already got, but who they might be getting in the future. How do you think that might affect how the Republican Party operates?
So that's a great question, because the standing wisdom has been that making comments that are perceived as anti-black or racist or xenophobic would hurt Trump with these demographics. But we have seen that he was able to make some inroads, specifically with Latino voters, despite saying these things. And one of the things I think people get wrong about identity politics is people don't seem to understand that people can be multiple things, right? People can be black and also working class and also Christian and also gay and just multiple things. And so which identity is most prevalent for an individual may vary and may be different from the way in which you primarily identify that person. Um, the reality is, I think the Republican Party is very confident in their standing with working class voters. And Black and Latino voters are disproportionately working class, less likely to go to college than white voters. And so there's room right there. And they feel like if they can continue to message to these voters, perhaps some of the more problematic things that come from the former and future president and some surrogates will not hurt them as much as they have in the past. Now, something I'm waiting to see. I'm of the firm belief that one of the reasons Trump did as well as he did, compared to how he did in 2020, is because he's not on people's TVs every day, not like he was heading into 2020. Even if he was there were clips of him from the campaign. There weren't clips from him like he was like when he was in the White House and on the campaign trail. And so someone asked me yesterday in a class, do I think people will get so tired of who Trump is that will bother them enough that'll lead them to vote against him come midterms? I think it's possible. I really do think it's possible. We don't know for sure. But if Trump continues being who he was, the decency thing, like I think people's tolerance for decency, or the indecency, should I say, that they just saw will be tested.
Yeah, actually, I wanted to go over to take a question from our audience. One of our questions, McKenna asked about the impact this will have on institutions like Hopkins. And, so J.D. Vance famously said that universities are the enemy. That was a big speech he gave at a national conservative meeting. And this, in a way, I think feeds back to the questions we asked earlier about how the parties are realigning about institutions and expertise. So, Soren, could you just talk a little bit about generally how you think universities like Hopkins, schools, this person mentions the School of Public Health, all of that might be altered by the Trump administration? Again, we've talked a lot about Congress so far, but another one of our questioners, Emma, said, why do you think Trump will listen to anyone? And at least where the administration and the executive branch is concerned, he's probably going to have a lot more control of the executive branch than he did in his first administration. So talk a little bit about how our own institution here at Hopkins might be influenced by some of what's coming down the road.
Um, well, first of all, I think the private institutions, I would say the private liberal arts colleges or universities are very differently situated than the publics, and also people always forget the Christians. There's an awful lot of Christian colleges in this country. Um, I think places like Hopkins with your big old endowment and your nice Bloomberg building on Pennsylvania Avenue are going to be fine financially, right? I think there are questions. You talk about public health. An awful lot of that money comes from NSF and NIH, Institute of Health. And I think there's going to be probably some really interesting questions about what happens to that money. Now, I will say, in the first Trump administration, when the first Trump administration was calling to cut NSF funding, Congress gave it 20-30% increases every year, the Republican Congress. So I think this is a place where I wonder what the I don't know what's atmospherics and what's real, right? I have trouble seeing a world where there is massive cuts to these things, to science, because we know that's a source of growth, and we've seen those budgets maintained across administrations. Um, that said, I think COVID is a massive disconnect. God only knows what it means if RFK Jr. becomes, has a job in the White House as healthcare czar. Um, what does that just mean? We fund, as has happened in places like India, where we just fund a sort of goofy line of research that looks into stuff, but it's not like India's R&D, government funded R&D investments have fallen. My instinct is it's more like that. We just open up a channel and spend a little bit more money on some stuff that we all think goes nowhere, because in the end, all these people understand, and I put JD Vance at the top of this list, understand that the research in particular is a massive driver of economic growth and opportunity. That said, there will probably be more sort of attacks, demands for institutional neutrality, things like that, many of which I think are probably very good for universities and workplaces writ large. Because they need to wrestle with the fact that they represent 3 or 4% of the country. Um, but I think in many ways, the bleeding edge of that fight will be on the public institutions in the red states, not in, no offense to I'm affiliated with Chicago. You got Hopkins, you got Harvard. Like, these people are fine. These people are not at risk.
Yeah, Eugene, I guess this gets at a one style of explanation. So again, there's a lot of anxious people, presumably on this call. Just socioeconomically, we know anxiety is often around our things, but also just what happened this week. And one of the ways that people sometimes, like Soren, try and salve our anxiety is to say, well, that would be crazy. They would never do that. Right. So I'm just classifying Soren's last comment in that category, that would be bonkers. Nobody would ever do that. But how confident should we be in that, right? What are the areas where you think the Trump administration might be most likely to do something that we would right now sitting here classify as that would be crazy, they would never do that? What should be the thing the folks listening here from home might want to pay attention to?
Yeah, I mean, I don't feel comfortable saying that there is something that we know for a fact that will not happen. I want to encourage people to not assume that the worst will happen every single time, and not because of some like worldview or values, but just because if we can look at the first administration, there are things that the president tried to make happen, like overturning the Affordable Care Act, that did not happen. There will be promises that he has made on the campaign trail that will not come to pass, not just because of who he is, but that's what campaigning for president means. The reality is there is not a single president you can name who achieved every single thing that he campaigned on, not just because of his political opponents, but also because of people within their party, the party, and also because the reality of making certain things happen. It's just not as easy as giving a speech saying that you're going to make something happen. I do think there are things that will happen that people on this call are worried about happening. And that's just the reality of someone winning who you don't want to win. But I think the president and for the future and former president and their transition team are in the process right now of trying to figure out, well, how can we make some of these things actually happen that we said happen? It's probably going to be a little more difficult than what I said. And that's true. I think one thing that's really important to remember about Donald Trump is he's incredibly temperamental. And whoever he puts in place, who he likes, who is going to move forward with something that you don't like, the odds of that person still being in that role a year from now, much less 3 years from now, it's just very like unlikely based on what we have seen. And so lastly, one of the challenges that I think he will have in making certain things happen is that some of these projects are long term, and you need people to be in them. And I mean, I don't know what's going to happen with the RFK thing. I'm fascinated by it. And whether or not this love fest between these people that 6 months ago were saying very negative things about one another will remain 6 months from now.
So just on that, to wrap this up, I want you to give a really quick kind of exit thing on what is the thing that you think is most likely to happen in the Trump administration that people in general are not heavily weighting now, right? What's your sort of surprising prediction about either in policy or politics or whatever about something that's going to happen that is not currently like in the mainstream of what people are talking about? Soren?
I think there will be uh we we've seen very clear statements from people around Trump that they don't care where Congress sends money. It's their decision. And I think, I mean, Nixon got, it was impoundment during Nixon, and the first Trump's first impeachment was over withholding funds to Ukraine. And I think one of the really interesting questions is where and how they use that power and what the backlash is from Congress. Because the backlash was pretty stark. This is boring. Like if we got into a conversation about OMB's apportionment decisions, your eyes would cross. But I actually think that's going to be one of the places that'll be an early tell of where the conflict is and how they use it and how they don't. Now, that's sort of not the question Steve asked me because it's something they've told us. But I think, but asserting you have a power and deciding when and how to use it are different. And I think the when and how they use a bunch of these powers is actually going to be the interesting question.
Eugene, take us out with a shocking prediction.
Well, I wish I had a more clear shocking prediction, but my prediction is a little more general in the sense that I do not think Donald Trump is going to be able to do everything on day one that he said he was going to be able to do. There are things that people expected to happen, will expect to happen immediately. People who supported him, that will take a little longer to happen. Which is not to say they won't happen at all, but you know, like the millions in deportations, and you know, the end of Russia-Ukraine, and you know, the Muslim ban from, you know, some of these things are not there. It's going to take a little time for the change. I've talked to voters. They're like, my gas prices are dropping. I'm going to be able to get a down payment on a house, blah, blah, blah. I think people are going to be waiting a little longer than they think they are.
Yeah, I think that's actually a great thing to go out in, is a reminder that some of the things that they're talking about doing are actually quite administratively difficult. You're mentioning deportation. Deportation is a huge, even if you think it's a good idea, it's a huge implementation challenge, right? The Tory government in Britain was saying that they were going to be sending a lot of migrants to Rwanda, and they got almost nothing done, despite the fact this was like a major agenda item for the Tory government. And this is one where this administration is not just going to be dismantling the administrative state, but they're going to have to actually build up a lot of administrative capacity to do that with an administrative bureaucracy that may not be super enthusiastic about that task. So thank you guys so much. I'll pass this back to Amy to take us out.
Yes, thank you very much, Soren and Eugene. Steve, you've been a fabulous moderator. I'd also like to thank Lilliana Mason and Leah Wright Rigueur, who were part of our first panel. And I'd also really like to thank the audience at home for tuning in for this important conversation and for your terrific questions. I'm sorry we couldn't get to all of them. We at SNF Agora will undoubtedly host future conversations like this. So please be sure to look for us at snfagora.jhu.edu. And to find out more about our in-person and virtual alumni events, please visit events.jhu.edu. So thank you again. I hope you all have a wonderful afternoon and that we'll see you again.
Thank everybody.
Thanks.